Good morning. It is my privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today. And so I've got two kind of introductions. One is the one they wrote that I have to read to you, and then the one is the one I'm going to do. So let me get through the first one. Shane Claiborne graduated from Eastern University and did graduate work at Princeton Seminary, and in 2010 received an honorary doctorate from Eastern. His adventures have taken him from the streets of Calcutta, where he worked with Mother Teresa, to wealthy suburbs of Chicago, where he served at an influential megachurch, Willow Creek. As a peacemaker, his journeys have taken him on some of the most troubled regions of the world, from Rwanda to the West Bank, and he's been on peace delegations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Shane is the founder and a board member of the Simple Way, a faith community in inner-city Philadelphia that has helped birth and connect radical faith communities around the world. He's married to Katie Jo, a North Carolina girl, who also fell in love with the city and with Shane. And at least that's what I heard anyway, I don't. And they were wed at St. Edward's Church, formerly abandoned cathedral in which homeless families relocated in 1995, launching the beginning of the Simple Way community and a new phase of faith-based justice making. Shane writes and travels extensively, speaking about peacemaking, social justice, and Jesus. Shane's books include Jesus for President, A Red Letter Revolution, Common Prayer, Follow Me to Freedom, Jesus, Bombs and Ice Cream, and Becoming an Answer to Our Prayers, and his classic Irresistible Revolution. He's been featured in a number of films, including Another World is Possible and Ordinary Radicals. His books are translated into more than a dozen languages, and Shane speaks over 100 times a year, nationally and internationally. His work has appeared in Esquire, Spin, Christianity Today, The Wall Street Journal, and he's been on everything from Fox News to Al Jazeera to CNN to NPR. He's given academic lectures at Harvard, Princeton, Brown, Liberty, Duke, Notre Dame. None of those are Lutheran schools. Gettysburg, Susquehanna, Villanova.
Those two.
I'm sorry. And Shane speaks regularly at denominational gatherings, festivals, conferences, and around the globe. What I wanted to say is, we had this event 2 years ago. We invited Nadia Bolz-Weber, and following that event, someone came up to me and said, why in the world would you invite someone like that? Do you think we should all get tattoos? And I think the reason that we invite the people we do, including Shane, is to provoke you. And I think that word is important. Sometimes that word can mean annoying or difficult. But for those of us who are Lutheran, who value the priesthood of all believers and a sense of vocation of ministry for all of us, vocation is a calling, vocare, from the Latin, and provoke means to call forth. And so I think we need to hear people who are provocative, who provoke us, to call us forth, to think and to change and to be who we can be as priesthood and part of God's ministry. I said earlier this morning when we were over in the other room that we need to take a deep look at ourselves and how we operate in our society, particularly many of us from a position of privilege, and that we need to change the way we see the world and the way that we choose to live in it, and that we need to transform the Jericho road of life, that it becomes safe for all to travel. And so, Shane, I'm putting a little pressure on you, but I want you to provoke us, to call us forth to be all that we possibly can be for the sake of Christ in the world. So, Shane, come on up.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to our day together. This is an ideal time. We don't have to feel too pressured by time. I get a couple of opportunities to share, and then we're going to open it up for conversation. Nadia is a good friend. I got less tattoos, so I think whoever said that might have missed the point a little bit. But anyway, well, you don't have to worry about any tattoos here, And I got my southern accent. That's to disarm the heathen. So, we're ready. So, I get to talk this first session, we get to talk about love a little bit. And then in the second session, we'll talk about economics some. But it's all sort of blends together, doesn't it? Growing up in Tennessee, there's a lot of things I love about Tennessee. And I grew up in the church. I grew up Methodist, and I know I'm in a house with not many Methodists here today, but I can remember growing up and just falling in love with Jesus, and we had this time where they gave an altar call, and we all got born again, and sometimes I joke that every summer we had made a tradition of it. It was so good the first time, we'd go every summer and get born again, and it was like the highlight of our year. And then I started to, really realize that there's got to be more to being a Christian than just getting born again every year, or as my friend Tony Campolo said, you come to the altar singing just as I am, then you leave just as you were and keep living just like you always had. So I really started to go, there's got to be more to it than that. And I started reading the Gospels. And boy, I don't know if you've done that, but wow, things just started spinning, for me. I read all of these things that Jesus said, and then I looked at the church, and I was like, how do we get this thing, Because like the Methodists, we got the fire on the cross, it's got some good roots and stuff. And then, I was so bored, though, and I read John Wesley, and John Wesley was such a fireball, He said, if I should die with more than 10 pounds, may every person call me a liar and a thief. I betrayed the gospel and the poor. And John Wesley that said, if I don't get kicked out of a town, I wonder if I really preach the gospel, So I was talking to Methodist bishops, and I said, I guess the question is, if John Wesley was alive today, would he be a Methodist? It was like... couple of them like that joke, there's so much that I came to love in the church. I felt really embraced and cared for in the church, which I know is not everybody's experience, so I don't take that for granted. But I did get a little bit bored. And then I met these Pentecostal kids in my high school, and I was kind of class clown sort of guy. I was prom king. It's a small town, but I was pretty well liked in my high school. So I took the dare from my Methodist friends to go talk to the Pentecostal kids. They were new at the high school, and so they said, go ask them if they speak in tongues. So I thought that was cool. So I went over and I said, hey, do you guys speak in tongues? And they're like, heck yeah, man, you should come to worship tonight, And so I did. I went, and it was awesome. Like, people fell on the floor and stuff. My mom thought it was a cult, but I loved it. And they did this thing called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. Right? And where we did these really bad skits. I mean, skits are scary enough in general, but these were like really bad ones, where we'd be driving a bus and the bus would wreck, and all the kids that didn't know Jesus, the demons would come and drag them to hell. And my friend's dad played the devil, and he was really good. There we were, born again. Even some of the, I think the choir director rededicated his life. It was pretty, scary, the Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames thing. And then there kind of came a point for me where I realized, I didn't become a Christian because I was scared to death of hell or because I wanted crowns in heaven as much as because Jesus is good. And the more I looked at Jesus, the more just mesmerized I became. And so I ended up going to Philly originally to study the Scripture, because I wanted to study the Bible and I wanted to study the world we live in. I like how Karl Barth said we've got to read the Bible in one hand, but we need to read the newspaper in the other, right? So that our faith doesn't just come an escape plan, and a license into heaven, but really fuels us to care about the world that we live in and see the kingdom of God as something that we're not just to hope for when we die, but something we're to bring on earth while we live. So I love that kind of landed theology. And so I studied sociology with Tony Campolo, who's now a dear friend. He's a kind of wild Baptist evangelist, and I studied the Bible. And I don't know, like you, part of what we really began to see is how ironically we've sort of lost track of Jesus in a lot of our Christianity. It was Gandhi that he was asked if he was a Christian. He said, "I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians took him more seriously." And I think I started to see that. And so if you look at some of the studies that have been done in recent years, like the Barna Research Group did a study where they went to every state. You may have seen this. The results of their study were released in a book called Unchristian. A couple of friends did. And what they found was that the number, they went to every state in the U.S. and asked non-Christians what they think of when they hear Christian. The number one answer was anti-gay, anti-homosexual. Number 2 is judgmental, and number 3 is hypocritical. I'll stop there because the list doesn't get much better, that we're irrelevant, we're out of touch, like all these things, prudish, all these things that people thought of. And part of what broke my heart was when I thought of Jesus and how differently we've become viewed in the world, how it must break Jesus' heart. Because people didn't encounter Jesus and walk away scratching their head going, why doesn't that guy like gay folks? So I think we got something pretty wrong. And so I started thinking about that, and I realized that the church had become pretty good at teaching me what to believe, but not as good at teaching me how to love. And that's really what Jesus said they will know we are Christians by, is our love. And that didn't make the statistics on the Barna research list. Actually, it didn't even get mentioned enough to make the list of what people said. It was the very thing that Jesus said that they will know we are Christians by, which is our love. And so the last 20 years for us has really been trying to learn how to love, to love the world as Jesus loved it, and to love people as Jesus loved them. And we've been in our little experiment with that on the north side of Philadelphia. A lot of it started when my college friends took me down to hang out with homeless folks, because that was so outside of my trajectory from East Tennessee. Just to give you one little confession, when I came to Philly to go to school, I put my yearbook from my high school on the bookshelf, and it had the Confederate flag on the front of it. And so my friends were like, "Whoa, what is that?" I'm like, "That's my high school yearbook." They're like, "That is also not cool," And I got educated, but there were so many things that were so different coming from Tennessee to North Philly. And I can remember when we first started going downtown to hang out with folks on the street, I was so nervous that someone would hear my southern accent and just think me an easy target for a mugging. And so I hid all of my credit cards and my money and everything in my dorm room while we went downtown to spend time with people on the street. And while we were downtown hanging out with people on the street, someone broke into my dorm room. Awesome. That was a lesson. Stole my credit cards and went to TJ Maxx. I know, because we caught them on tape, But the folks that I was so nervous around never took anything from me, And I thought of how easy it is to be conditioned to trust, certain people and be suspicious of others. So I very quickly got baptized in a new way of seeing people. And then as we were going through college, we became deeply troubled by the pattern in our city and in our country of systemically discriminating against the homeless and what's become known as anti-homeless legislation, right? So laws in Philadelphia made it illegal to sleep in public places, illegal to ask for money on the streets. There were sidewalk ordinances that were passed that would not allow someone to stoop on the ground for more than a few minutes. And then some of the final laws that passed in Philly made it illegal to share food in public places. Something about that just didn't feel right, you know? And so we began to organize around that. And that's originally like kind of where we got involved in sort of justice work was in response to the no feeding laws, we had public picnics, you know, and they were inspired by the Gospels, Luke 14, you know, where Jesus talks about the kingdom of God as a banquet. And so we said, let's throw a banquet and let's challenge these laws. And it was, you know, as some of you probably know, we got in a little trouble for that. And we originally went to jail. We ended up sleeping in the parks and having these picnics, and it was actually perfectly okay for weeks and weeks. And then out of the blue, the police surrounded the whole park and they arrested all of us. We weren't even really given a warning, and it was much to my mother's chagrin. She's like, "This is not how I raised you, son," you know. But it's also why, like, I find it funny when I meet Christians that, you know, like sometimes they're like, "Oh, my life was such a mess. You know, I went to jail. I did, you know, all these hard drugs and did all this stuff, and then I met Jesus and everything came together." If that's your story, God bless you, you know. But for me, like, I pretty much had my life together, and I met Jesus, and He messed me up, you know. And it was actually not. I didn't go to jail before I was a Christian, but because of it, you know. And I ended up. We fought our case in court, and we won on a number of different challenges. But it was great because I had a shirt on in court that said Jesus was homeless, and the judge first thing he did was he goes, "Jesus was homeless. I didn't know that." And I said, "Yeah, Your Honor, in Scripture, Jesus says foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, the Son of Man has no place to lay His head." And the judge said, "You guys might stand a chance." And he said, if it weren't for, you know, people that broke the bad laws, we wouldn't have the freedom that we have. We'd still have slavery. And he said, you know, it's the story of this country from the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement, the Underground Railroad. You know, this is these guys are not criminals, they're freedom fighters, and he dropped all of our charges. So you can pray that we keep getting that same judge. And we actually, those same laws resurfaced more recently, and the mayor, Mayor Nutter at the time, he made an anti-feeding ordinance you may have tracked just like 2 years ago, and it was actually really interesting because his order was like, you can't feed more than 4 people. It's like something about 5 that was just too much, you know, like, and so we were ready though. We still had our T-shirts and stuff, you know. So like it's 10 years later, but we're like, hey man, we got shirts that said, if Jesus had done the fish and loaves thing in Philly, he would have gone to jail. And it was amazing. Folks came out of the woodwork. But what was amazing was to see the church being the church. You know, I mean, we had folks that were Pentecostals and Catholics and, you know, Mennonites and Quakers and Lutherans, of course, and mostly Lutherans, you know, and but as we went to the public hearings, it was incredible because this one woman, she stood up and she said, 15 years ago, God told me to start making casseroles and taking them out to the homeless. I've been going every week for 15 years, and if the mayor wants to stop it, then the mayor better talk to God. You know? And then after her, this Catholic theologian argued that actually when we feed the homeless, we don't believe that we're just feeding some pitiful poor person. We believe it's a sacrament and that we're feeding Jesus in his many disguises of the least of these. And so this theologian argued that to say that we cannot feed the homeless is to say we cannot feed Christ. and it's actually a violation of our religious freedom. It went all the way to a federal court that declared, in fact, it is a violation of our religious freedom to say that you can't feed someone on the street. How about that, right? So I think of what the power of what it looks like, for the church to be the church and to stand up for love in a world where there's a lot of other messages, and I think right now it's such a time as this where there are lots of rhetoric and policies that are being driven out of fear. And we know that, as Scripture says, perfect love casteth out fear. And we can see what happens when fear drives us. We can do really, really scary, terrible things when we're driven by fear instead of by love. And I think of Philadelphia, and one of the things that I'm proud of is we have an entire movement of the church around the new sanctuary movement, creating hospitality for families that are in crisis, especially due to immigration. So we have a whole network of churches and Christians, sort of an underground railroad of its own sort that has created sanctuary space in our city. And in fact, our city, as you may know, has become a sanctuary city where our city council voted to not deport, not to uphold ICE deportations and things. And when the Pope came to Philly, we had one of the families connected to the new sanctuary movement that spoke and gave her testimony next to the Pope. It's something that I'm really, proud of. And there's one really wonderful story in the middle of it where this one congregation had started to welcome families that had nowhere else to go. And like many cities, there's a lot of lawyers and folks that are available to help people with documentation and all that. But I love the simplicity of this church that just said, we've got this building. As long as there are people on the street, we're going to allow people to sleep here while we figure other options, more permanent options out. And there was a government office that came in, though, and told them that they couldn't run a shelter. And it was interesting because these guys are pretty Pentecostal too. And they said the government kind of telling them that they couldn't run a shelter didn't go over real well. And so they said, we're gonna pray about this. And like a week later, they met with the city again, and they said, we've heard what you said, that we can't run a shelter, so we're not gonna call it a shelter. We're just gonna call it a revival. And they said, unbelievable. You should have seen, the news was trying to cover all this, right? They're like, the nuances were becoming tiring, and so they're like, yeah, the pastor just said they're no longer running a shelter, but they're running a revival. Back to you, Bob. But we went one night, my friends and I, because it's just around the corner from us, and you had all these families that undoubtedly would be on the streets, and they shared their stories. We sang and we worshiped together. We had communion, a beautiful service, several hours. And around 10 o'clock at night, one of the pastors said, all right, that concludes our formal service. The next 8 hours or so will be silent meditation. Contemplative prayer, And as far as I know, that revival's still going, But I think of that, and I think of this call, at the heart of Jesus where he said we're to be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves. And isn't that an amazing call for us right now at such a time as this? I think that we would be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves, that we would bear witness of God's love in creative, courageous, bold ways, that refuse to allow the principalities and powers to hold love hostage, right? That we actually can live fearlessly in the midst of the world that we live in. And as I think of part of what it's looked like for us in Philadelphia to try to imagine God's kingdom come in our neighborhood, on our block, as it is in heaven, there kind of comes a time where we start to notice the the obstacles to that, right? And some of those in our neighborhood are economic, like we've lost a lot of jobs. We've got 20,000 abandoned houses, so we're doing a lot of affordable housing and things like that. But along with that is a drug economy and some other associated violence and things like that. There's a lot of things in my neighborhood I'm proud of, but the violence is one of the things one of the monsters we wrestle with, you know. And so I want to tell you a story about how we've seen the church kind of rise up on that. And first of all, like growing up in Tennessee, like we all had guns, you know. Like, I mean, we got country music songs that say, "This house is protected by the good Lord and a gun, and if you come unwanted, you'll meet them both, son." You know, so like I grew up, you know, hunting and stuff, but you start to see that these worlds, you know, Western Pennsylvania or East Tennessee, like can be pretty different from the streets of North Philly. We had one kid that moved from California into our neighborhood, and he must have been 8 years old at the time, and he scratching his head, he's looking at the gun shop right on our block, and he goes, "Why are there so many gun shops when there aren't that many deer?" It's awesome, right? And but I think that what we began to see is that in Philadelphia we've got almost one homicide a day, and of course about 11,000 gun deaths in our country every year, just homicides, twice that if you count suicides. And so you know the reality of that is difficult to communicate, you know, but I think we begin to realize that they're not just numbers, you know, they're names, they're kids, they're children made in the image of God. And one night, I heard the gunshots and ran outside, and this young man fell to the ground. He had been hit, and I held his hand as the ambulance came, and then the next morning, we found out he didn't make it, and he died at 19 years old. His name was Papito. And there kind of comes a point where Dr. King said, speaking of the Good Samaritan story, he said, you know, we're called to be the Good Samaritan, but after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say maybe the whole road to Jericho needs to be rethought, that we need to figure out what's landing people in the ditch. And so we began to look at our neighborhood and asking, you know, where do the kids get the guns? And we saw that there are literally like a block from our house, there's a gun shop that is not just any gun shop, but it was rated one of the worst 5% of gun shops in the country for guns sold irresponsibly, ending up being used in violent crimes. And so we began to prayerfully vigil outside of those. And some of you may have heard of the movement in Philadelphia called Heeding God's Call. That is now a really beautiful ecumenical fellowship of folks committed to ending the gun violence. And we had that Easter season right before Papito was killed, right before Easter. And so we ended up having one of the most powerful services I've ever experienced. You'll see a picture of it here in front of the gun shop, where just a couple blocks from our house. And the young men in our neighborhood carried the cross. And they carried the wooden cross in front of the gun shop. And then we read the very familiar passion narrative of Jesus' violent death on the cross and the women weeping at the foot of the cross. But then we heard the stories of mothers who had lost their kids. We invited the mothers forward, and they told their story, and their tears are streaming down their face, you know. And something so powerfully happened. I mean, we had some good preaching too about how it's Friday, but Sunday's coming, you know. And we know in the end that life is more powerful than death. The tomb is empty. But we kind of sat in the pain for a little bit on Good Friday. We even had a rabbi that was like, I don't come to a lot of Good Friday services, but I'm liking this one, you know. So this was it. It was one of the most powerful services. And afterwards, this one woman came up to me and she said, I get it. And I said, tell me what you get. And she said, God understands my pain because God knows what it feels like to lose a son. And I realized that was Papito's mom. And the power when our gospel connects to the streets, right, that we live on, when our liturgy kind of gets into the world and connects in that way is I mean, it's sacramental. It's something beyond words, right? And that's what happened that Friday. And now we've seen, we actually just had our Good Friday services in the streets again. And so on Good Friday, we went to the memorials where folks were killed. And we connected, Jesus to the streets we live on. It was so powerful. And you'll see a picture of one of the congregations here that has placed memorials to the folks that have died. So there's T-shirts with the names of everyone who was killed. And in fact, I think it was like 270 names in 2015. And so we carried those shirts on Good Friday into the streets as we kind of lamented and as we worshiped Jesus and thought of Jesus. And then beyond the Good Friday, one of the images that caught our attention when it comes especially to a culture of violence and death is the Hebrew scriptures in Micah and Isaiah, that wonderful image of beating swords into plows, right, and spears into pruning hooks. So we got pretty excited about that. And the more you read about that, it's very interesting because the early Christians pointed over and over and over to that image of God's people beating swords into plows as evidence of who we are to be in the world. That we, just as Jesus turned a cross, which was only known for its horror and death and humiliation, into a channel and conduit of God's love. Like we are to transform a world of death into life and to turn the tools that have taken life into tools that can cultivate life. And so we got excited about that. And we got some welder friends that gave us some welding lessons and stuff. And so we learned how to transform weapons, which is pretty fantastic. And it's amazing what you can do with, you can show the next one there. These are some of our welding lessons. But with social media, Facebook and Twitter and stuff, what you can do is just stunning. Like I put up on our social media, anybody want to donate some guns? And people did. People started. We got this. This is an AK-47 someone just had laying around, and this guy said, yeah, I decided not much good was going to come from that, that's not one you hunt deer with, So we took it and turned it into a shovel and a rake, and then. So that was the before shot, and this is the AK-47 after we went at it with our Mennonite welders and stuff. And then we started getting images from around the world, We got a guitar that was made out of handguns that plays music. Got this guy, that one really plays music. And then there's a guy in, you can show the next one there. There's a guy in Mozambique that has a saxophone that's made out of a semi-automatic rifle. He's jamming out on that. And then we got some pictures from my friends in Iraq who had poured guns into the streets. I know they're a little tricky to see the slides here, but they poured guns into the streets and ran over them with a steamroller. And they said, we wanted the kids to drive. So they let the kids drive with their parents with them and to catch a vision, right, for a world free of violence. And so as you see some of these images, one of the most powerful transformations that we did was more recently, we had a handgun that was donated from Philadelphia, from I think it was in an abandoned house, and we took this one, and we decided to do it a little differently. We instead of just the the blacksmith, welder friends of ours, we invited the victims of gun violence, so the moms and dads that had lost their kids. And this one woman, as we heated up the metal from that, she took the hammer, and her name's Sherry, and she began beating on this gun. And she's got a picture of her son right here on her jacket. Her son was killed in just an absolutely senseless, random act of violence in Philly. And as she's beating on that gun, with every thump of the hammer, she goes, "This is for my boy." And we saw that gun repurposed and transformed that day. And you'll see a couple of images of what we did. And actually, I brought, I can't do this on airplanes, but I can do it when I drive. I brought it with me. And this is the plow that we made, and this is the barrel of that same gun that Sherry was hitting. And now, as we break ground, we kind of hold this as a sort of a sacramental thing in our office. And anytime a congregation's doing a tree planting or building a rec center, or folks in Philadelphia want to break the ground, they can do it with the repurposed metal from that gun. And so I'll pass it around so you can hold it, but also so you can, pray for our streets and pray for our world as we think of that powerful image. And let me read the words of this is Justin Martyr in 165 AD. "We ourselves were well conversant with war, murder, and everything evil. But all of us throughout the whole wide earth have traded in our weapons. We've exchanged our swords for plows, our spears for farm tools. And now we cultivate the fear of God, justice, kindness, faith, and the expectation of the future given us through the crucified one." So as we think of that message, and I think the power of the consistent message of peace and nonviolence of the early church and of Jesus, it does raise the question of how we're to live, right, in the world with that same courage, the same imagination to transform a world of death into a world of life. I think one of the most important umbrellas for young Christians is a consistent ethic of life, that every human being is made in the image of God, and every time a life is destroyed, we lose a part of God's image in the world. And I see that, really resonating. I think that the idea of death is very, very real to a lot of people, as we think even recently of the terror attacks, and we think of the violence that's kind of prolific in our world. And I can remember right after September 11th, one of the things about living in Philadelphia was, being sandwiched between New York and D.C. We knew a lot of people that were affected by that, as I'm sure many of you did. And people were trying to deal with their grief and their fear, their anger. And I can remember one of the things that happened in Philadelphia was someone dropped a banner from City Hall. So it was hanging out the window of City Hall in downtown Philly, and it said, "Let's kill them all and let God sort them out." And so there were those expressions, but I can remember hearing not too long after that a different story, a different way of dealing with the grief. And it was the family victims, the victims' family members from September 11th, what has now become known as September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. But at the time, they were just a grief and support group, and they had lost their husbands and wives, their mothers and fathers and children, and they got together to grieve. And then as they began to see the war ensuing, their whole prayer became, our grief is not a cry for war. Please don't kill in our name. And they went on delegations to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I heard about them along with the wonderful work of the Christian Peacemaker teams. And then I got a call, inviting me to go on one of those delegations. And that was, I think, one of the times where I felt in my life, there aren't a lot of times I feel real crystal clear, this is what God wants, but that was certainly one of those moments that I felt as clear as ever before that it was the right thing to do. And so I went to Iraq, and as some of you know, our team ended up being there in March of 2003, and so that was during the bombing and the shock and awe campaign and all that. And we saw, there were dozens of us. I mean, we had doctors, nurses, pastors, veterans for peace, all kinds of different folks there. And we saw the bombardment of Baghdad, which I think at the time was over 900 bombs a day. And it was mind-boggling. I mean, it's hard to really put words to what we experienced. But what we also felt like everywhere we went was this incredible sense that there is another way, and that there, everywhere we turned, we were shown such grace and hospitality and love. So we were volunteering in hospitals and visiting people in their homes and different things. And then as the bombs started to fall, we gathered for peace, to pray for peace. And there was this one service right in the heart of Baghdad where thousands and thousands of folks had gathered to pray. And there were so many folks that they couldn't get in. They were kind of spilling into the streets. And the bishops from all the different denominations stood up, and they had written a statement written to Muslim people, and they read it together. And it was fairly simple. It basically said, we want you to know that we love you, and that we know that you are made in the image of God, and that we all come from this same dirt that God breathed life into, and we come from the same dysfunctional family of Abraham and Sarah, and we want you to know we love you today. And then one of the bishops pointed to the cross, and he said, this cross doesn't make any sense to the world of smart bombs. As the scripture says, the cross is foolishness to the wisdom of this world, but it teaches us another way, that we can interact with evil without becoming it, that we can love even those who would want to harm us, and we can say to those who hurt us, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And it was so powerful. Everybody busted out in Amazing Grace in Arabic, so I kind of hummed along. But afterwards, I kind of came forward, and I had my little Pentecostal thing going, and I was so moved. I'm talking real fast to the bishop, and I was like, Bishop, I got to tell you, this is powerful. I feel God in this place. And I kept going, and I said, I had no idea there's so many Christians in Iraq. And then he stops me in my tracks, and the bishop says, yes, son, this is where Christianity started. And then he, pointed outside, and he goes, that's the Tigris River and the Euphrates. Have you heard of them? Because the Garden of Eden was right down the street, man. And I'll never forget that conversation. And how, what a reality check it was, as we thought of that troubled land and that land that's still so troubled. And then as we were leaving Baghdad, about half of our group decided to leave, and the other half decided to stay. And so we're driving from Baghdad to Amman, Jordan, which is a pretty treacherous drive through the desert. And when we were leaving Baghdad, I mean, there were cars on fire and bridges down and bombs are still falling. And so we're driving along and we hit something in the road that popped the tire of our car, and it spun our car off the road. Our car flipped over, and all of us were injured. A couple of my friends were injured pretty badly. And with the car on its side, we kind of managed to get everybody out into the side of the road. And this is one of those moments where you're like, whoa, you know, I mean, you can't call 911, like there's no cars around, there's no, what do you do? And so we just started praying, you know, and then we end up seeing this car way in the horizon, and it makes its way to us. And this is the first car that passes. It stops, and these Iraqi guys jump out, and they wrap their arms around us, and they escort us into the nearest town, a little town called Rutba, and it's in the Anbar province. And so that little town, when we got there, it was pretty big news, you know, like people started gathering, they're bringing us gifts and everything, and they can tell that our friends were hurt pretty badly, so they quickly get us to the hospital. And when the doctors come out of the hospital, they're waving their hands, and they're saying over and over everything that's been bombed in their town. And then the last thing they said is, one of the bombs hit the hospital. And it hit the children's ward, and so we've closed the whole hospital down. And I'll never forget, our instinct at that point was still thinking about our friends, you know, and thinking what's going to happen to them. And I look at this doctor, and he says, "Oh, don't worry, I can tell you're worried. Don't worry, we'll still take care of you. I just needed to explain, we can't do it inside the hospital." He said, "So we're going to set up a clinic for you." And they like put a bed out for each one of us, and they saved my friend's life. And I'm so moved by all this. I'm like, my American mind instinctively goes to money. So I'm thinking like, we got to pay them, you know. And I get all of our money from like 10 of us in this big pile, and I give it to the head of the hospital, and I say, "We just want to say thank you." And he goes, I'll never forget. He goes, "You just want to say thank you? Then say thank you." And he goes, "Keep your money." He said, we don't want you to think that there's any other motivation from us except that we love you. And we hope that if you found us on the side of the road, you would take care of us too. In fact, it's come to be a way that I read the Good Samaritan story with totally new eyes now. And that story, you know, he said, all that you can do to repay us, the doctor said, is just continue to tell the story of what we did for you. So we tell that story a lot. And there's a community down in Durham, North Carolina, that named their community Rutba House. And it's named after the love of that town. It's always kind of been our dream to get to go back. But it's not real easy to travel to Iraq, you know, and so we ended up just a few years ago, we got to go back, and we kind of jumped through all the official hoops and everything, and we get over the border, and when we get back to the town of Rutba, I mean, it is like we're royalty or something. Like the whole town's gathered. They found all of the doctors that had saved our lives, and this is like 7 years later now, you know, that they ended up finding the doctors, and they get all the imams and the sheikh and all the leaders together. And this one person goes, "You got to understand, we don't get a lot of visitors." And then it said, and there are a few people that are not real happy about this. You know, they might want you dead, but there's not many of them. And then he said, you know, so they said, "Don't worry about that." And they slept by our bed with AK-47s and stuff. You know, I'm like, that doesn't fit into my theology, but thanks for the hospitality, you know. And I got to tell you, like, it's one of the most powerful experiences. As we were there, we reconnected with these doctors that had saved our life. And then they said, "You got to go to meet the mayor." So we go meet the mayor, and it's just like official delegation, you know. And And when we get to the mayor's so excited because he's heard about all this, and he goes, this is the stuff that moves the world. He says, this is what we need, not more drones and bombs and guns. We need relationships, friendships across the borders of our countries. And he said, we need a sister city in the United States. And I'm like, Philadelphia, and the mayor goes, no. He goes, Philadelphia is too big. He goes, we're just a little bitty town, And then he says, I've been to one place in the United States, and I loved it because it reminded me of Rutba. And he gets a translation, comes back, and he goes, stuns all of us because he says, I've been to this place called Durham, North Carolina. Have you heard of it? I'm like, whoa, right? We have a community called Rutba House in Durham. And the mayor, he goes, then it's done. And then he goes, we will start a community in Rutba, and we will call it Durham House. And we will be committed to building bridges and to trying to build a world free of violence. And I can't explain how all that worked, but I am convinced that when we step out and we get outside of what's comfortable and predictable, the Spirit really moves, and in ways that some of the most powerful experiences of my life have been where I've just stepped a little bit outside of what's comfortable and familiar, and then we've been able to see God move. And it's that which I think of as we kind of think about the world that we live in right now. And I think of the vision that gave birth to the Christian Peacemaker teams and the group that I was in Iraq with. And this is one of the things that my brother Ron Sider said. He said this in 1984. He said, unless we are prepared to take risks, to risk injury or death in nonviolent opposition to the injustice our societies foster, then we dare not even whisper another word about peace to our sisters and brothers in desperate lands. Unless we're ready to die developing new nonviolent attempts to reduce conflict, we should confess that we never really meant the cross was an alternative to the sword. Making peace is as costly as waging war. And I sometimes think, that idea, Father Dan Barrican says, it's not that we've tried the cross and it's failed us, but we haven't tried the cross with the same courage and willingness to take risks as we've tried the sword or the gun or the bomb. And it was Dr. King that kind of coined the phrase, he said this some 50 years ago, but he said these are extreme times that we live in. The question isn't whether or not we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hatred or extremists for love? And I don't know about you, but I think the world's seen enough religious extremists for hatred. No one kills with the passion with which people kill when they are convinced that God's on their side. And we've seen Christians do it. We've seen folks blow up abortion clinics. We've seen terrible things done. Folks burn the Quran. We've seen Jewish extremists. You go in the Abrahamic Mosque in Hebron, you can see the bullet holes in the wall from a Jewish man that went in and tried to kill a bunch of Muslims in prayer. And of course, we're familiar with the stories of so-called Muslims that do terrible things in the name of their professed faith. And so I think that what the world's really, starving for is for us to have the courage to love, right? And to love in the face of such evil and such violence. So give us the courage, God. Amen. Give us the courage. We pray that you would help us to trust in the way of your cross when we're so prone to rely on our chariots and horses or even the violence that kind of infects our own hearts. So give us courage to love. And help us to form disciples who are committed to your love, no matter what the cost. Folks that are willing to be an interruption to the patterns of hatred and violence and exclusion. So continue to form us into your body, that we can carry your love into the world. Amen. So we've got a little time to talk, but I know I've laid a lot on you. So as we prepare to open it up, when we were leaving Iraq, one of my buddies heard these kids singing a song, and he's a musician, so he recognized the song, even though they were singing it in Arabic. And so he grabbed a little handheld recorder and recorded the kids. These are kids in Iraq singing the beautiful spiritual "We Shall Overcome."
نمشي يدا بيد نحن نمشي يدا بيد نحن نمشي يدا بيد اليوم في أعماق قلبي أنا أؤمن نحن نمشي يدا بيد اليوم نحن لسنا خائفين نحن لسنا خائفين نحن لسنا خائفين اليوم في أعماق قلبي أنا أؤمن نحن لسنا خائفين اليوم We shall overcome We shall overcome We shall overcome someday.
Amen. So, we're opening it up for conversation. Yeah.
You said you have an office, you work out of an office for students in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we've got a little community that we've been building for 20 years now on the north side of Philly. And it started out of a struggle for housing with homeless families in Philly. And then we over the years have been just building a village together. So we have a lot of formerly abandoned houses and stuff that we fixed up, and everything's kind of hubbed out of the same little triangle of 3 blocks, and we've got murals and community gardens and all that kind of stuff happening. Maybe a dozen or so properties all on the same block together. And so we kind of have rhythms that we're creating as a neighborhood where we just had a big Easter celebration, and we have like sort of a liturgy of our neighborhood, you know, that includes holy days, but it also includes things like back to school. So every Labor Day, we have like 700 kids that we throw a huge back to school party for and stuff like that. So, and that's kind of our hub of everything. Kensington, Allegheny. Yeah, right on the north side of Philly. Yeah.
You keep saying we. Who are we?
Well, I started the community, the we, like when we started 20 years ago, was a bunch of college friends and I. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we started the community in afternoon session. But we pulled our money together, inspired by the early church, you know, for years, we worked part-time jobs and stuff in order to pull money together to, and then we work in the neighborhood too. So now, like, it started with 10 of us piled in a little row house, and now it's grown into a little bit more of a village where there's neighbors that are long-term been there longer than I have that help lead a lot of the stuff that we do. So like every week we give out food bags to a bunch of neighbors, but all the folks that do that used to receive food bags and now give them out. We've got young people that I live with a 23-year-old young man that grew up on the block, and now he helps lead a lot of our youth work and everything. And so he's a social worker now in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of layers to our community life. Yeah, man.
And with that success, how has the city responded?
The city has been, well, I guess you gather we've had some ups and downs. Well, I mean, we've got a really great councilwoman now that's working with us on a lot of housing stuff, and we've got, we had a really big fire 8 years ago that burnt down a bunch of it started in a city-owned abandoned factory, and burnt down a bunch of our houses. And it was amazing, though, because our neighborhood really came together, and we've rebuilt that block now, and we call it Phoenix Park, coming out of the ashes. So we're now working together with the city and a bunch of other partners to create a permanent park space and community center there, and have some friends that had the resources to do that. They're going to put a few $1 million into that block, so it's really great. And then we're doing a lot of housing stuff because we found that the waiting list for housing was there's like 3,000 families on the waiting list for affordable housing. But there's 20,000 abandoned houses. So we are now taking abandoned houses and we spin them off into affordable housing. So that's called Simple Homes. It's one little piece of what we do to try to create stability in the neighborhood and affordable housing. So every family does 350 hours on their own house. We sell the houses for zero profit, zero interest. So we usually can sell a house for about $35,000. And families can pay, $500 a month and own their own house. And there's a little bit more to it than that, but it's a pretty great model. So, yeah. All this stuff we just stumbled into, like we weren't housing experts. I think that what we are trying to do is what Ray Bakke, he's a wonderful theologian, he says we talk a lot about exegeting the Bible, but we've also got to exegete our neighborhoods. So read, what is the context that we live in? And so, seeing affordable housing is a great opportunity to build a neighborhood. And so those are all things that everything we do is really relationally driven. But when you got friends that are homeless and, 10 abandoned houses on the block, that kind of adds up into doing affordable housing. So, yeah. Yeah.
You have a lot of volunteer support from the local universities, colleges.
We do. A lot of what we believe in is like the neighborhood. We don't have a lot of outsiders coming in. We did that for years, and it created what we called a fishbowl. There's a lot of people kind of coming and going. So there are times where we have a really great support, like where we'll have contractors and stuff that volunteer with us on to do an abandoned house, or a church congregation that'll support an abandoned house. So if you got 30 grand laying around, hello, but I think that there's a lot of partnerships. And one of the ways that we talk about the work in our neighborhood is that there's 3 groups of people working together: Remainers, Returners, and Relocators. So Remainers are long-term indigenous neighbors. Returners are folks like the 23-year-old I live with that's from the neighborhood that went off and got some skills and brought them back to the neighborhood. And then relocators, folks like me that are outside the neighborhood coming in. And so all of those groups, we sort of work together. And we work with a whole bunch of other groups too. So we have like a recovery community that's doing all recovery from drug and alcohol addictions. And it's a pretty amazing group called New Jerusalem. So they have about 6 houses there of all maybe 60 people living in advanced recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. So, yeah.
From one thing to another, I heard that at one point you used the Sermon on the Mount as your talk. Would you give some context to that? Why? Where? What was it?
Yeah. Well, so I was at a youth event that is kind of known for the hyper programming on stage, like all kinds of, not quite pyrotechnics, but almost, and stuff. And so and it's dear friends that organize it. So I don't know, I just felt very driven. I'd spoken almost every year for a lot of years. And so one year I felt very compelled just to read the Sermon on the Mount and kind of let it speak for itself. And so that's what I did. And not many people bought the tape, but yeah, but so, yeah. Yeah.
Do you dialogue with gangs in the neighborhood or anything like that?
We don't have a lot of gangs per se, like especially in our neighborhood. We don't have the organized gang activity that a lot of other cities do. But yeah, I mean, but we try to have bridges and conversations with anyone. We do have a lot of drug activity, which is very daunting. Yeah, to be honest, it's very, very tricky to. A survey showed that the drug economy is the second biggest source of income in Kensington, and so that becomes pretty difficult to tell young guys in the corner don't deal drugs if we don't have another opportunity for them. But their business is toxic, so it's tricky to figure out how to do that well. So you could pray for us on that. Yeah.
Shane, you talked about your work globally and your work locally. Can you say something about the way you all share your time and your resources, the way you steward your gifts for local mission and the kind of stuff you're doing right in Kensington, and having this sort of bigger global vision for loving your neighbor in other parts of the world like you have. I'm curious about that because I think sometimes we make sort of an either or about those things. Either we kind of think about global ministry and supporting some of that effort, or we try to do some things locally, but both of those things we can't do both. So can you say something about that?
Well, I think whether we're talking about economics or kind of a culture of violence, they're all they overlap a lot. Like if you think about how the global economy has affected Kensington, it's that we've lost 150,000 jobs. We've got 700 abandoned factories. So we do a lot around trying to think responsibly about how we consume, and how, like, where do our clothes come from? Where's our coffee come from? Things like that. So that like when I spent a bunch of time with my friends in El Salvador, and they drove us through the maquiladoras, like where the sweatshops are. In fact, she kept saying, like, this is a slave shop, this is a slave shop. She kept saying it's fruit, it's the fruit one. And I didn't understand what she was saying. She was saying it's fruit of the loom, right? And so, like, we kind of see that side of it on the other side of borders like El Salvador, Mexico. But I think we can see the side of that in Kensington too. Also the mass incarceration, and the buildup of prisons that directly parallels a lot of this, to where, I mean, the statistic right now is 1 in every 3 young black men born today can expect to go to prison. 1 in 3, a third of African American males born today can expect to go to prison. So I think as we look at the economic side of that, half of those are from crimes related to drug trafficking or economics, or trying to figure out ways to make ends meet when factories, kind of the rug has been ripped out of our neighborhood. So those tend to be very related, I mean, right in Philadelphia, our schools are going bankrupt, and we have a $400 million prison in the works, and so I mean, a sociologist friend of mine said now they're predicting the amount of jail cells needed by the dropout rates, which are 40%, in our neighborhood. So I think all of that, like, ends up being very interconnected. But the challenge, I think, is that these issues have to become personal, and we can't make poverty history until it becomes personal. And the urgency of these are not just statistics, but they're names and faces. And so what does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? And I think we'll really get into some of that in the afternoon, because I think that's the biggest challenge. Is it's not that folks who have resources don't care about poor folks, but I think a lot of times folks with resources don't know many poor folks. You know, there's actually a deep division in the church racially and economically, and until we bridge that, I think we will continue to see a lot of the inequities continue to kind of perpetuate themselves. Yeah, that was. Did you say something else? That was one thought on.
That's good for now.
Yeah. Well, with the violence too, I think like what Dr. Martin Luther King did so powerfully is he said, "I've told kids in the ghettos that violence won't solve their problems, but then they ask me, why does our government use massive doses of violence to try to bring the change that it wants in the world?" And Dr. King said, "I knew I could no longer speak against the violence of kids in the ghettos without also speaking against the violence of my government." So one of the powerful connections that we've tried to make too when it comes to following Jesus is nonviolence, is that it means trying to, model and teach young people other ways of resolving conflict than violence, but it also means critiquing a government that right now is, it's $20,000 a second spent on militarism. And so I think that perpetuation of violence, whether it's through military or the death penalty or whatever, that's something we also have to challenge, And one of my favorite moments when I got back from Iraq was all the kids had decorated our sidewalk as this welcome home mural. It was beautiful, and it said, "Love our enemies, war no more." And it was done in sidewalk chalk, and it was beautiful. It was the kids on our block, and since then we've been able to do Skype calls with some of the young people I was with in Afghanistan, and I visited these amazing young people in Kabul in Afghanistan. They're known as, their blog is Our Journey to Smile, and their name is the Afghan Peace Volunteers. And so these are 15-year-old kids that are fed up with violence. And so they do these Skype calls or kind of international phone calls every month, and you could get them on the phone with your youth group or young people in your neighborhood or whatever, and you call these young people and just hear their stories, and hear what it's like to live under the constant hum of drones and, under the environment that they live in. And so we got to visit them, and it was amazing because then I did a Skype call with the kids on my block, and they're listening to these kids in Afghanistan share their dreams about living in a world where they don't have to worry about their friends getting killed. And what do you think they're thinking? Kids on my block are thinking those are the exact same dreams that we have. They were finishing each other's sentences. So I think there's power in connecting, young people around the world. And we have a lot of capacity to do that we haven't in former generations. So. Yeah. Sunday morning, we go to worship in our neighborhood. My wife and I generally go to Mass. It's probably the most racially mixed congregation in our neighborhood. The most kind of neighborhood-based is our Catholic service right around the corner. So we go there. I got a little Pentecostal, a little more charismatic church I go to at night so I can get my dance on, But yeah, best of both worlds. But we've always been an eclectic group of Protestant, Catholic, Anabaptists, and together. So we've never done our own worship services. And in fact, we deliberately sort of said, there's one thing that our neighborhood has a lot of, our church services. So why would we do another one? So we tend to go in our neighborhood on Sunday morning. And that's something we really value. And now there's there's all kinds of cool stuff that's brought those churches together, like the gun violence, trying to end the gun violence and other things. We got a bunch of young guys in the neighborhood that started a male mentoring league because they said, male mentoring ministry, where they said part of the problem for young guys is that we don't have a positive male in our life. And if you look at the statistics of folks in prison, it's, off the charts. It's 90% of the men don't have a positive male in their life. So they started this ministry called Timoteo, pointing to Paul and Timothy's relationship. And now it's 200 young men are being mentored through that. It turned into a flag football league, naturally. And but But every one of our like 12 teams is sponsored by a local congregation, and that was started by young men in the neighborhood. So there's just all kinds of really beautiful stuff happening. So we try to join that. Yeah, I saw another couple of hands, and I know we're almost at lunch. So yeah.
I was taken by the image of the community event, in gun violence event, the big banner, and there was a cross, and then there were 8 American flags. Can you tell me anything about that?
NRA, yeah, no, that was a pro-gun rally that came, and so that often happens, you know, and in fact, I'll say this though, like the pro-gun group, I think has been one of the It was a very difficult thing for us to figure out how to navigate that, because they said some really terrible things on their websites and told everybody to bring their guns into our neighborhood, and told them not to leave them in the car because it's a sketchy neighborhood and people would break in their cars and steal their guns. And I mean, just really like very offsetting things. But I was so proud of how we really centered ourselves in Christ and in nonviolence, and we took a pledge of nonviolence, and all the young men in my neighborhood, as we debriefed it, they said, we understand what Martin Luther King felt like, you know, because people were spewing really hate-filled, racist things. I think that entire group was white, whereas our group was very diverse. So there were a lot of dynamics, you know. The folks said a lot of really mean things about me, and you know, these guys were very level-headed, and we started to pray because we didn't want to outshout them. So we started to pray at one point, the Lord's Prayer, and they started singing on top of it, God Bless America. And it felt like there's real principalities and powers, you know, and all of that. So we did our best to try to wear them down with our love and not outshout them or whatever. But I will say this, that probably one of the most encouraging things was Hunters Against Gun Violence that really stepped up. And these are gun owners that are against gun violence on our streets. So I think that more that we are able to create partnerships and coalitions, because there's great books like Atwood's book, America and Its Guns, that talks about how the growing sentiment, even of gun owners and NRA members, is that we can do better than the current laws that we have. And so public safety and gun rights are not necessarily at odds with each other. So I think that those minority voices are still out there, and they're very loud sometimes, but that's what that was. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that theme? What are your thoughts about some of the cities across the country, across the state, that are trying to pass laws just within the principality?
Yeah. Well, I wish that we could see those able to sustain themselves, but sadly they get overturned so often, you know. Like for instance, the one law that I think is a very reasonable one is called one handgun a month. That would limit the amount of handguns that someone could have to 12 a year, 1 per month. Seems like a pretty great law. But it gets blocked over and over. You know, as cities pass those, it gets overturned. You know, so that now you can buy countless guns. So I think that's the kind of conversations we need to create, though, are that what we're not talking about is taking away people's hunting rifles and things like that. So, but to say like, we're not stopping the Constitution, you know, right to bear arms. But when you say how many is enough, you know, maybe 12 a year is enough. That would, like, even things like that would significantly change the face of Philadelphia, along with, you know, background checks and things like that. So I'm a believer in that. I think we can do a lot better. I'm glad there's a national conversation happening with that. Yeah, it's a great book. If you haven't read America and Its Guns by Atwood, that's a pretty incredible theological expose of the gun environment that we live in. So what happens in Philadelphia is straw purchasing, where someone who cannot legally buy guns has a person that will buy for them. It's kind of like buying a minor alcohol, and it's often a woman that's buying guns for a man that is blacklisted from buying guns. And so it's as clear as night and day, that they go through and pick out the guns they want. You can often see even outside the exchange or them getting the same car together, things like that. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to stop. And ironically, the gun shop that we were vigiling outside of, we were not trying to close it down. We were actually asking the owner of the gun shop to sign on to a 10-point code of conduct that 400 mayors said if gun shop owners would adhere to these 10 points of responsible business, and they're very reasonable, like that it would radically transform the gun violence on our streets. So you can see all those on our website and stuff, but those, sadly, that gun shop owner didn't, and his gun shop closed down. In fact, 2 of the worst gun shops in Philadelphia have been closed down now. But it came from, that wasn't our goal. Our goal was to see guns not flowing into the streets. But it took clergy getting arrested. We did sit-ins, and a dozen clergy were arrested, and what happened is it put the gun shop on trial, and people saw what was actually happening in these gun shops. And in the ensuing days, those gun shop owners' licenses were revoked, and now those gun shops are shut down. So, yeah.
Do you have a population of undocumented people in your area?
Yeah.
How are you supporting them?
Well, really through the new sanctuary movement is the mechanism for creating a really great, it's wonderfully led by folks who are immigrants here, recent immigrants, and incredible coalition of clergy behind them. So yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah.
Do you work with Power?
Yeah, Power's a wonderful organization we work with. Yeah, Bishop Royster and everybody. Yeah.
You love justice and are doing kindness. How do you personally walk humbly before your God?
Well, my wife helps with that. I don't know. But I think community keeps your feet on the ground too. I'm very I live in a very down-to-earth way in my neighborhood, and so I even with decisions of how much I travel, I discern that with my closest friends and community and things like that. And I'm really grateful to have a lot of support as we do that. And there's things like that we are cautious of power and things like that. So we have a lot of ways that we kind of institutionalize subversion of that, and where we, like my income is capped off. My wife and I's income is capped off at a certain amount, which is what we determined that we need to live off of. And so everybody kind of does that. So then, things like how much money we generate is kind of irrelevant because it all comes into the nonprofit. So even money from the generous donation that you all give for today goes into our nonprofit, and my living stipend doesn't change. So, yeah. Learned that from John Wesley and other folks, it's good. Yeah.
So how do you help people disengage from this consumer culture that we sometimes feel trapped in? How you're modeling with a capped income, but how do you teach that simple way in churches?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to talk about after lunch. So meanwhile, let's go grub and just get gluttonous, and then we'll come back and talk about fasting and stuff. All right, so thanks, Brett.